austerity in the beginning can feel like poison. Oh, I have to give up all the things that I like, all these things that I enjoy. But material happiness is just like nectar in the beginning and poison at the end. So we may enjoy these sense objects for some time, but then at the end of life, when our body becomes weak and we begin to receive the reactions to that material enjoyment in the form of increased attachment to the material world, then the suffering is terrible. Have you ever seen an old person who wanted to enjoy but couldn't? And this is hellish. This is really a hellish condition. There's a nice story. One time the king asked his spiritual advisor, he said, well, isn't it true that now I'm a king, so I should enjoy myself now, and then when I'm old, I can perform spiritual activities and become enlightened? And the spiritual master said, no, actually, you should perform your spiritual activities while you're young. Otherwise, you won't be able to be detached when you're old either. And the king said, I don't believe it. I want to see an example of this. So the spiritual master set up an interview with an old man who was dying. One of the ministers of the king, one of the advisors of the king, was very old. He was like in his 90s, and his body was very sick, and he was almost at the point of death. So the spiritual master set up a special situation. The king went to see him, and they were sitting there talking with this old man who was very pious and who had served the king his whole life. And then they had the princess, the beautiful young daughter of the king, enter the room on the other side. And what happened, as soon as the princess entered the room, boing, his attention went to her. Here he is talking with the king and the spiritual master, the two most important people in his life. And this beautiful girl enters the room, and he can't help himself. His attention is immediately drawn, even though he's on the point of death. Why? Because he didn't train himself from the beginning of life to be detached from sense gratification. So as soon as the objects of the senses come into range, then immediately his attention is drawn. Prabhupada used to give the example of a dog. A dog, his nature is to chase a bone. So you can take a dog, dress him up as a king, and put him on the throne, but as soon as somebody throws a bone in front, then he'll jump off the throne and go chase the bone. But that's the nature of a dog. He can't help himself. So, similarly, if we think that we can live an ordinary life of sense gratification and then at the end we can suddenly, somehow or other, change, it's not going to happen. Actually, the longer we remain engaged in material activities, the harder it is to change. So in India, for example, there's a saying, a saint in truth is a saint in youth. In other words, if someone is actually spiritually advanced, they will start training themselves while they're still young. This is my experience also. I was searching for a spiritual master, and finally I found Srila Prabhupada, but it wasn't for a few more years that I could actually join the temple and get the training, how to be detached. I joined the temple when I was 26 or 27 years old. And for me, it was more difficult to follow the regulations of the temple in the beginning because I was older than most of the other students. However, now that I'm in, how old am I? 60? Yeah, I'm 60 now. It's become very easy, out of habit. But if I was to live the way I was living in my 20s, up until now, and then suddenly decide, oh, now I want to be a holy man, I'm going to change my whole lifestyle, it's not very practical. It's very, very difficult. Because the mind acquires momentum, habits. And the more impressions of a particular kind of life we build up in the mind, the harder it is to change those impressions. It's better to start when you're young. In fact, most people who attain enlightenment in this life will attain it in their 50s or so. It's very rare that they will attain it younger than that, but it does happen. But most people will attain in their 50s while they are still strong and able to perform austerities and so forth. This training has to begin early in life to really be effective. So it may seem like poison in the beginning. Oh, I have to give up all these things that I enjoy. It's discipline. Discipline isn't always fun, but we do it to get the result. Just like I may not want to go to work, but if I want to pay my rent and have a roof over my head, I have to do it. That's just life. That's just the way it is. And so similarly, to discipline ourselves in the mode of goodness and give up our attachment to the objects of the senses paves the way for spiritual realization later on. If we're really serious about spiritual life, we have to train ourselves like that for a significant amount of time. And then we can get the result. Let's see, is there another question?
Here one.
How did all the armies come to Kurukshetra? Where have all the records gone, except Bhagavad Gita, gone about this large war? Well, Florian, that was 5,000 years ago. For example, in Europe, there was World War I and World War II. But if you go to the places where the battle happened, you don't see any signs of battle. I mean, maybe if you dug down into the ground, you might find some old relics, pieces of weapons or something like that. But it would be very difficult to reconstruct from those fragments what actually happened in that place. The only way we know is by the historical records. And 5,000 years ago, the only people who kept historical records were kings or the holy men. So since in those days things were written on palm leaves, they didn't last very long, 5 or 10 years at the most. Then they had to be recopied. So only the most essential records would be recopied because it was very labor intensive. They had to have specially trained monks who knew Sanskrit. So a lot of education was required, a lot of training. It was very expensive. So only the most essential things, which were of course the sacred texts. So Mahabharata is a very good history. If you read Mahabharata, especially the Yuddha Parva. Yuddha Parva means the record of the war. It describes the battle in detail. Who did what to who, when, how, and why. And it also describes the history of all the personalities leading up to the battle. So you get an understanding of their motivation, their background, and why they were fighting. So really you should read Mahabharata if you want to know all these details. Next.
Carly asked, what is your favorite form of the Lord?
You'd never believe it. Well, I have a few. I have several. Of course, Govinda, the cowherd boy, the eternal flute player, and Lord Chaitanya, and Lord Nrsimha, the half-man, half-lion form. He's my favorite. Anyway, let's see. Krishna Prapti was about, what question did Krishna Prapti have? Wait a minute. Oh, you passed it.
No, he was the same comment. Want me to go back?
Can you post your question again, Krishna Prapti? We can't find it. Look at the end. Look at the end. Thanks.
So we read Erica or Gloria?
Erica?
What is it expected from a master of his disciple when he begins, and what is that it expected from the disciple at the end?
Oh, that's a big question. But basically, you should follow the 4 regulative principles. No meat eating, no illicit sex, no intoxication, no gambling, no speculation either. Read the spiritual literatures, whichever ones that are attractive to you. I understand you've been studying Bhagavad Gita, but that's very good. And then we can also send you Srimad Bhagavatam, Sri Ishopanishad. We have so many literatures in Spanish. In fact,